Welcome back to the channel, ladies and gentlemen. Today, I can't stress how much of a banger you're in for. This story is absolute gold. Get what I did there? No, but on a real note, I did put so much time into this story, so if you guys go on to enjoy this one, or if you simply want to support your boy, please leave a like, since the like goal for this banger will be 2,000 likes. So grab your snacks, your popcorn, your full body anime pillow, and enjoy.
Hey Ross, sauce it up.
We begin our story off with Izuku holding both of his parents' hands as they would be swinging Izuku back and forth, going, "You ready to find out what your quirk is?" All the while Izuku would be happily holding their hands, swinging back and forth. That is, until suddenly their hands would feel hard and Izuku would feel a slight bit of pain, only to then look up, noticing that both of his parents had been turned into solid gold. As Izuku, having noticing this, would try to rip his hands out, but seeing as the gold hands were grasping his own, Izuku had a really hard time. This would lead to him starting to wail and scream, as people would eventually take note of this, and one of the doctors inside would rush outside to see what the commotion about, noticing that Izuku was being held by two individuals completely covered in gold. Thinking that they were attempting to steal the kid, the man would immediately leap into action, using his metamorph quirk to lunge in and push the two people away. However, this would cause Izuku to fall over with them, with the man looking in confusion, asking what's going on, with Izuku saying, "Help! My parents turned to gold and I can't get my hand out." The man staring at Izuku would realize that he clearly made a mistake, before going inside, grabbing some sort of oily substance and pretty much applying it to where Izuku's hand was, leaving Izuku to be able to squeeze it out just barely from both, and then staring at each of his parents, saying that he doesn't know what happened. One second they were swinging him in their arms, and the next they were gold. The man would stare at him, asking him if he was on his way to get his quirk checked, and Izuku would nod to that. The man staring at Izuku and realizing that he must have been the cause of this, and due to them not knowing what his quirk is, it's best to figure out before he starts touching the kid. So, telling Izuku to follow him and not touch anything, he would guide Izuku inside of the doctor's area, where once there, he would immediately tell all the other doctors to help him run some tests. This is when Izuku would be tested by multiple machines, with some that require a more hands-on approach, essentially being transformed into solid gold. And when the doctor would use his stethoscope to try to, hear Izuku's heartbeat, Izuku holding to it going, "It's cold," would suddenly turn the entire thing to gold, with the man being shocked, going, "It's incredible. He possesses the ability to innately turn anything he touches into gold. This could change everything. The entire economy of Japan would be booming if only we could get this kid to create gold, and if it passes on the scale, well, there's no telling what this could do." The man having these thoughts and saying this aloud would be overheard by a woman nearby, who would say, "Hey, get your head out of the gutters. This is a small kid who just turned his parents into gold. I doubt the first thing the kid wants to do is use his powers to make gold for ya." As the man would say, "You're right, sorry." And he would walk away, making sure to look busy, all the while any chance he could get, he would make sure he could catch little glimpses of the kid and overhear any information about him. Because if there's even a chance that he can get his hands on that brat, then there's no telling how rich he could get. That said, Izuku would have a couple more tests ran on him, and they would eventually name his quirk Midas Touch. Izuku, hearing this, would then question why that's the name of his quirk, as they would go on to tell him the story of King Midas, about how long ago there was a king who was granted a wish, and using that wish he clumsily decided that anything he could touch would turn to gold, with this eventually turning into one of those be careful what you wish for stories. And with Izuku hearing that, the kid would be horrified, as they would explain, "But don't worry, your quirk is a little similar, but that doesn't mean that you won't be able to revert things. At least we're not too sure, so don't worry about your parents." And then Izuku would start bawling, going, "My parents are gold! I'll never see them again!" But this is when the lady, getting down to eye level with Izuku, would say that there's a good chance that Izuku will be able to undo those effects, and his parents will be just fine. Don't worry. Trust her, she would say, staring at Izuku's eyes with the look of determination and just like trustability factor, I guess you could say. Izuku, seeing this look in her eye, would, sob a little bit more before wiping his tears off and saying, okay. And after this would happen, Izuku would sit in the room waiting for a couple of minutes when eventually a police officer would arrive alongside the woman, who would go on to tell him that though his quirk is incredible, the fact that his quirk could turn into something very profitable means danger for the boy. So they can't just place Izuku in the care of a close family member. They're gonna be needing to place him in a place where he can not only be protected, but also guided to how to use his quirk and understand the repercussions of using a quirk like that. I mean, genuinely, this thing could crash the economy. This is when Detective Tsukuichi, looking at her, would nod, saying that he understands, going on to explain that he's actually been thinking of a place in mind where they could send the kid to not only learn how to use his powers, but probably the safest place in the entirety of Japan. She would say, "You don't mean," as he would nod, saying that he knows somebody who can get them in contact with someone there. And so, with that being said, Detective Tsukuichi would lower himself to eye level with Izuku before telling him not to worry, that before long he's going to get the training that he needs to be able to not only turn his parents back, but to even use his power for good. He's going to be a real hero, he would say. Izuku, hearing this, would smile brightly, saying, "I am?" And he would get excited for the prospect of controlling this quirk and helping his parents, since after all, Izuku was in the business of helping people. So we all know how Izuku would react to this. And so, spending the night under the watchful eye of Detective Tsukuichi, Izuku would eventually find himself at Island, where he would go on to meet somebody by the name of David Shield, who, since Izuku's still a little kid, he wouldn't exactly understand who that is. But from the moment that he looked at the man, he could tell that he was kind of trustworthy. And then, this is when the biggest shocker came. All Might stepped in the room, and with Izuku being the biggest All Might fan of all time, he would start freaking out, going, "All Might, it's you!" To which Izuku, freaking out, would then get an autograph before All Might would explain to him that this is his good friend David Shield, and he has a little bit of a gift for him. Ever since he heard his story, he worked day and night so that he could make these gloves for Izuku so he could deal with life a little easier, before going on to explain that essentially they're pretty much just quirk dampening devices, and by placing these on, he should be able to make contact with anything without worrying about turning it to gold. So Izuku, hearing this, then turning to David, would smile, thanking him for that, with David ruffling the young kid's hair, promising that on this island, he's going to be having the time of his life while his parents get better. And Izuku would nod, going on to explain that he's going to do whatever he needs to do to save his parents. So David would smile, saying that that's the attitude. And with that being said, we would get a mini time skip, as we would see the young Izuku not being so young anymore. He'd be at about the age of 10 years old, and with that would come a lot of growing in his quirk department, since now Izuku had completely mastered the ability of touching things and not turning them to gold, as well as to what extent something turns to gold. For instance, let's say that you hand Izuku a rose. He's able to control whether the stem, the leaves, or the petals turn to gold individually. With the reason that Izuku learned how to do that being that Izuku dreams of becoming a hero, something that he would constantly tell David Shield about, and David would always smile, telling him that that's the spirit, never confirming or denying Izuku's dream to become a hero. As we then see David walk into the room that Izuku is currently training at, going on to tell Izuku that he's impressed. He's made so much progress over the last couple of years, and if he keeps progressing like that, then his parents should be home free in no time. Izuku, hearing this, would smile, with David looking to Izuku and telling him that over these last couple of years, he's become a real bright kid, with Izuku thanking David, saying that it's all thanks to him and Melissa that he's come so far. As David would reply, no, we've simply guided you along. You've been the one doing all the heavy lifting. Izuku would smile, as David would then speak up and say that he's sure Melissa actually did have a bit more to do with it than he did, with Izuku raising an eyebrow and him saying after all, he can tell the young boy wants to impress her, with Izuku going bright red and David teasing at him about the fact that he knows all along that Izuku's practically been in love with his daughter. I mean, after all, it's only natural considering Deku spends so much time with Melissa, and her being this older figure, Izuku couldn't help but look up to her, with those feelings developing as time would progress. That said though, after David would finish teasing Izuku, he would tell him that if Izuku manages to steal her heart, he might just let him date his daughter. He'd kind of be joking around, but he'd be a little serious, with Izuku taking this to heart, saying that he'll train to become the best hero ever, and there's no way Melissa won't notice him. Not directly saying that last part out loud because Izuku's not that dumb. But anyways, with that being the case, David would look to Izuku, putting his hand on his shoulder and saying, "Look, Izuku, I've been holding off on this conversation for a while now, but to tell you the truth, I don't think you're going to be allowed to become a hero. Truth be told, Izuku, your quirk is incredible, and it's been serving for the last couple of years to help our economy. It's been making a real massive difference, and if I'm being honest with you, I doubt the government would go and putting you in harm's way, going out to defeat villains, when they could simply use you to help the people in your own different way." Izuku hearing this would look at David going, "But I always wanted to become a hero. Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" Izuku would look down as he would feel heartbroken in this moment. He guesses he understands what David means because at this point he's pretty smart for his age, but he thinks that that's stupid. In the first place, they shouldn't have been using his gold to help the economy. That's not really right, he would say. But David would tell him that in this day and age, they're using everything they can to improve. And with Izuku helping his home country, he should be proud. Izuku would look at David telling him that he just wishes he had told him sooner, just kind of walking away in sadness, knowing that David had hidden this secret from him for so long and he had just now told him this. This would leave Izuku to locking himself in his room and shutting the door, with him simply thinking about all those dreams that he had of turning villains into gold before then unpetrifying them in a prison cell. They're all crumbling before him. But he would tighten his fist going, "No, there's no way I'm gonna let the government control me like a dog. I'm gonna use my quirk to protect and save people. That's right, All Might would want that too." But as Izuku would finish this thought, suddenly an explosion would go off, with Izuku's room shaking and him hearing chaos. Izuku would wonder what the heck's going on, him assuming that one of their projects must have gone haywire. After all, no villain would be dumb enough to attack Island, right? But suddenly, he would start hearing the screams of people and the sound of quirks being used all over the place, as well as the defense security robots activating and his door turning to steel, trapping him inside of it, with Izuku now fully aware that there's definitely a villain attack. And as some time would pass, with Izuku in his room holding his breath, just hoping that the defenses would work, when suddenly he would hear the sounds of large footsteps heading towards him before hearing a grunt and "Ah!" which would smash right through the room. This is when Izuku would see a large man with a super strength quirk that would have just broken into his room, alongside a pink orb that would be carrying people inside of it, with voices suddenly starting to become audible as a man would speak saying, "Is this him?" As the woman responsible for that barrier that would have been created would say, "Yeah, that's him," with him holding out the picture of the gold hair and golden eyes, with the man smiling before ordering one of his men to capture the boy. Suddenly, a man with a strange quirk that appeared to make him intangible would get so incredibly close to Izuku before suddenly Izuku could feel the worst memories flashing through his head as he would find himself in unconsciousness, then waking up in a strange room only to see all 6 of them standing there. As he would weakly get up going, "Where am I?" Before the man responsible for knocking him unconscious would say, "You're with the Sinister 6, mate." With Izuku trying to think of where he's heard that name before, but before Izuku could fully think about it, a deep voice would say, "That's not our name, Tremor." With the man seemingly saying, "Sorry, mate. Guess I got a little carried away there, yeah?" And in case you guys haven't noticed, I'm trying to do like a cool little like Australian accent, just because these characters are not just nobodies. I wanted this story to feel original, since I didn't just want to once again do the original story where Izuku goes to UA High, gets really overpowered, and eventually just destroys everyone. This is like a story that I genuinely want to spend my time with, and whether it's 40 minutes long, 1 hour long, 2 hour long, I don't care. I'm just loving writing this story. And I hope you guys enjoy these characters that I've created for myself, because this villain organization will be known as the Sinister 6. Just because honestly, I couldn't be bothered to think of a cooler name, so I just ripped off whatever I could remember with cool characters that I ended up coming up with, which you guys will see later on. But yeah, I just wanted to let you guys know in case you guys are like, who are these people? But yeah, no, they're my original characters. And please, please, please let me know down below in the comments if you guys go on to enjoy this video and like me introducing original characters and new concepts into the world. So with that said, let's get back into the story. Izuku, now aware of who his capturers are, would take a mental note of each one, staring at the one who appears to be a leader, as he would watch the man remove a strange black mask from himself to reveal blonde hair and blue eyes, backing up as he would fear that now having the knowledge of what he looks like, he might be in for death or something. However, this is when suddenly Tremor, the person with the Dementor quirk, would speak up saying, "Hey boss, so what are we gonna do with this young lad, eh?" As we would see Zoom grabbing at his hair and ruffling it, saying, "We've been over this like 6 times. You need to start paying attention." He would look at him before looking back towards the boy and going on to explain that they've taken him because they caught wind of what his quirk can do. And seeing as the boy has the power to turn anything around him to gold, he's going to be used as their personal piggy bank. With him going on to explain to him that if Izuku tries anything, well, he doesn't think he needs to explain what will happen. But after this would take place, one of the girls in the group by the name of Caitlin, who was the one who used the barrier quirk to transport them there, would say, "Oh, he's so cute, isn't he?" To which Tremor would reply, "The boy is a looker, yeah?" Until we basically then get the introduction of the rest of the characters, with me going over them all real quickly. Obviously the boss is named Zoom. He has a really cool little quirk that allows him to run fast. We got my boy Cage. He has a quirk that essentially allows him to walk through air. He's kind of like the henchman guy who doesn't have like a crazy quirk, but he's like his second-hand man because he's known him the longest. And he has like black hair with brown eyes. Then we have the illusionist. Her name is Trixie, and she has orange hair and she's the shortest of the group. Then we got Mr. Dementor himself, Tremor, who is obviously like the Australian dude with black hair and green eyes. And we also have the stereotypical buff dude, which is Rex with red hair, a dude with a poison quirk by the name of Reiner, and lastly, Caitlin, who has a barrier quirk that upon first inspection you would think it's busted, but the barrier itself is used more for transportation rather than for defense, because it has the durability of literal plastic, so it's kind of like a hamster ball in essence. But with that said, and with you guys now caught up to what these people look like, Izuku would then be told to get out and to start making them some gold. So Izuku, looking around at the place, would start checking things out, seeing that the place looks scruffy and just worn down. And as he would place his hand on each little object, completely turning it to solid gold, Izuku would simply turn to the man, asking if that's all he needs for now. The man would smile, placing his hand on Izuku's hair, ruffling it, and going on to tell him that if he continues to just do what he's told, then Izuku will be sure to live at least a half-decent life, ordering his subordinate Rex to put the kid in his room. And so a deep, scratchy voice would say, "Alright kid, come with me," as he would take the small boy into the room and turn on the TV saying, "Here, look, just like home." After this, he would ask, "You need to use the bathroom before I lock you up for the night?" And Izuku would kind of just look at him, nodding, as the man would take him, wait, and Izuku would try to search for any exit that he can find, maybe a window, but the man would simply say, "And if you're looking for an exit, don't bother. I already patched everything, so you're stuck with us for the foreseeable future. Plus, it's not like if you escape, we won't be able to capture you again, so just accept these conditions and we'll make sure that you live, like the boss said, a half-decent life." So Izuku, coming out with tears coming out of his eyes, would finally make his way into his room, with the person in charge of taking care of him for the night being Caitlin. Hearing the young boy's cries would start to feel horrible, being more sentimental than the others of the group, as she would go over towards Izuku's room and start to speak with him saying, Hey kid, it's not that bad. I know that you might not be with your mom and dad anymore, but we promise we ain't gonna hurt ya. You're gonna get your 3 meals a day and you can use the bathroom whenever you want. I know it might suck kind of feeling alone, but I guess you can sort of just think of us as your new family." Izuku would look at her crying, saying that if she felt bad, she would let him go, that he doesn't want to be stuck here, whether it be for years, months, or his whole life, he would say as his voice would crack while delivering that line. Caitlin, hearing that, would say that she understands that things might not be easy, but unfortunately they need him for their goals. Without him there, but before she can finish that sentence, a voice from the corner would go in to say, "Caitlin, be quiet. which would be Reiner, trying to make sure that she's not saying too much. She would then turn to the boy and ask if he wants to talk about something other than this, and he would kind of just nod his head as she goes on to ask what exactly Izuku's goals are. Izuku would look at her and say that his goal was to be a hero, but with the government finding out what his quirk was, they don't want him to be one. And strangely enough, Izuku almost finds comfort in this conversation with Caitlyn, telling her all the things that he's been thinking about, his anger, his sadness, but his disappointment most of all. Overhearing this, she would say, "What? That sucks. You mean to tell me the government wasn't going to let you become a hero just because you have a valuable quirk?" This is when suddenly a voice from the back would say, "Yeah, that checks out. Why in the world would the government want him as a hero when they could have him be a hero in his own way?" To which Caitlyn would say, "That's so insensitive." But he would simply scoff before walking away. He would leave as Izuku and Caitlyn would chatter on for the next hour, and over time, this would become a normal occurrence with whenever Izuku feels lonely, Caitlyn would take some time out of her day to go be by Izuku's side, eventually explaining to Izuku why it is that they became the group that they did, what her original dreams were, how she had always wanted to just be a regular housewife, and before that she had wanted to become a hero, but unfortunately due to the weak nature of her quirk, she wasn't exactly able to pass many entrance exams, and people just gave up on her. Her parents most of all, that were only able to afford so many entrance exams before they were just flat broke and couldn't afford anything else. She would say that she, much like many of the others of the group, were random misfits that happened to find their way to Zoom. And Izuku hearing this would say, "That's the leader, right?" He would ask what his quirk is, with Caitlyn saying, "Oh, Zoom? It's actually kind of funny. He named himself after his quirk, which by the sounds of it, I'm pretty sure you can guess what it allows him to do. He can run really fast, breaking the sound barrier. It's incredible." To which the shocked Izuku would ask, "Why isn't he your hero?" And she would go on to explain to him the tragic backstory that befell him, telling Izuku that he was actually trying to be a hero once upon a time, but unfortunately bad luck just struck him. While he was in the middle of being in his hero course, his father became deathly ill, and needing to cough up some money somehow, he resorted to robbing a bank, but unfortunately because of the fact that he still wasn't able to control his quirk, he ended up getting caught and got expelled from his hero academia. And after that news broke out, no other hero school wanted him. So after eventually completing a couple of months of juvie, as she's told, he turned to, well, the only thing that would allow him to make a good living and support his dad, thievery. And when that got him caught and landed in prison, by the time he got out, his dad was dead. The hero system failed him, kid. And when a man gets treated like that by society, you could just imagine how a man would respond. She'd go on to explain their own sad backstories, how each of them also went through their own struggles and eventually learned of Zoom and joined his ragtag group, whether it be for money, companionship, or in her case, family. Izuku hearing all these stories would kind of just sit down in silence, being told countless little adventures that they would go on, the times that they nearly got caught by the pro heroes, the time that they ran into All Might, with Izuku wanting to know more about that and her discovering that Izuku loved All Might and all things hero related. The kid was actually a mini genius and was able to deduce what their quirks could do, what they couldn't do, and all sorts of things by simply just looking at them use their quirk once. She would say that Izuku would be a valuable asset to the team if he ever wants a new family. And Izuku would say that while he understands why they became villains and joined Zoom, he doesn't think it's right. He would say that just because life knocks you down doesn't mean you get the right to knock others down along with you. He would say that when that happens, you gotta get back on that horse and try again. And looking down, she would say, "It's easy for you to say, kid, but that's enough talking for today." She would wipe some tears off of her face, and leaving Izuku there, he would just wonder what could have been of her life if she had simply had a little bit better circumstances. Izuku would realize that the world isn't as black and white as it was before, realizing that in reality, life was more like different shades of gray. And Izuku learning all this and having different conversations with different members, with one of the members who is more reluctant to speak to Izuku would be Reiner, who's more so focused on their goal and having Izuku manufacture gold for them whenever he can. Though if Reiner is telling the truth, he has a bit of a fond spot for Izuku. And so with that being said, as the passage of time would slowly progress, Izuku would get closer and closer to this weird group of villains, eventually starting to share meals with the team and actually live where they live. Not in his own separate room, but right in the mix of all of them. With all of them, with due time, kind of growing fond to Izuku. Rex would be the one to focus on him the most, trying to make sure that he can train the kid up, with them all hearing about his dreams to one day become a hero. With even Zoom catching a strong liking to Izuku, who would never outright admit it, always acting cold towards the young man, but Izuku could almost feel that this wasn't the real feelings behind Zoom. There was more to him. And so as more and more time would pass, Izuku would find himself getting stronger, alongside the aid of Rex and Cage, who would consistently train with Izuku, showing him cool new moves and applications for his quirk. Izuku would even share the story of his real parents and how his goal had always been to learn how to undo the petrification effect of his gold. So for years, the Ragtag team had always been trying to help Izuku out with that, but weirdly enough, it never worked, which would start leading Izuku to believing that maybe his quirk just didn't function like that. I mean, after all, it's not like somebody can shoot fire and then suck it back into their body. Izuku would start thinking to himself that maybe it's hopeless. Maybe his parents are. But that's when suddenly a hand would come upon his shoulder, and it would be Zoom, who would just give him a look saying, "It's okay, kid." With Izuku looking at him, knowing what Zoom really meant to say. And so, kind of slapping himself in the face, he would say, "Let's get back to training, yeah?" Yes, his friends would say, "Yeah, let's drink to that." And Izuku would kind of be around all of them, having his own little glass of apple juice, now having the age of 12 years old. Izuku at this point having already given them hundreds of millions of dollars worth of gold, which most definitely would have crashed economies in multiple places, forcing the price of gold to actually lower significantly since the introduction of Izuku into the world had become a thing, considering the fact that before there was a limited amount of gold and that's why it cost so much. But now with Izuku just mass producing it and these villain organizations selling it to other villains and those villains selling it, it just became a whole thing. So with that being said, and the group practically having made all the money they could ever need for a lifetime, this is when eventually they would hold the meeting, as they would all talk to each other about what they're gonna do with the kid. To which Caitlyn, in a bit of a horrified voice, would say, "Sorry for talking out of line, Zoom, but I think we should let him go." And after hearing that, Rex would say, "Yeah, I second that. I like the kid, and I don't really like the idea that we're over here stealing the kid's life away from him. After all, we're villains, not monsters." This would then cause a nod to come from Cage, who would agree as well, with Tremor saying, "Yeah, I agree. We should let the little man go and become a hero. Who knows, maybe one day he'll actually put a stop to our organization." This comment would eventually earn a little bit of a snicker from the boss, to which Reiner would get up out of his seat going, "You guys can't be serious. We've just finally managed to get out of all of our situations, and you guys just want to let the kid go? This is insane. I mean, I'm not going to act like I haven't developed a bit of a soft spot for the kid, but that still doesn't mean that I'm just going to let the little guy go. He's our golden goose. Without him, what are we? A little ragtag group of villains that's hardly managed to accomplish anything together? No, this is our big strike, and we're not going to stop milking this until the value of gold practically drops to zero." Zoom, after hearing that, would tell him that that's enough, to which Reiner would sit back down and everybody would start telling him to have a heart. That kid has become like family, and we don't treat family like that. To which Reiner would respond, "You're right," just going dead silent and not saying anything, with thoughts beginning to flood through his mind along the lines of that isn't how they treat family. But they just showed that he's not a part of the family. His opinion should matter more, and instead of just being silenced, he should have been heard out. But he understands how things are. He'll take the little golden goose for himself, since this little group of quote-unquote villains doesn't have the guts to do what's necessary. And so while the team would continue talking about the date where they're planning to release Izuku with a bit of a party, the group would all mostly ignore Reiner, with Zoom, aka Hunter, his real name, being the exception to that. And so as time would progress for our little villain group and they would gather little party supplies, Reiner would start planning things out, making sure that he understands the layout perfectly and setting up a trap for the group, since once he takes out Zoom, the rest of them should be easy. he's the only one who's capable of defeating him after all, since his quirk allows him to turn into poison itself, and this turns him into basically a perfect counter, since if you breathe him in, the battle's pretty much over. He's one of the biggest assets to the group, and among one of the strongest, with Rex being the only other member that could potentially pose a threat, but even that's giving him too much credit. And with the day of Izuku's release inching closer and closer, merely just days away, Reiner would enact his plan, jamming the communicator so the team won't have access to each other, locking every exit and making sure that every single air hole is covered up so that his poison will have maximum effectiveness, and then finding Zoom all on his own, distracted, hanging up a couple of party favors for Izuku, he would use his poison quirk on Zoom, immediately transforming his body to that of poison as it would enter Zoom's body in a gas-like form, as Zoom would start to convulse, with him feeling the effects of this and beginning to cough, going, "Reiner, why?" As Reiner would say that he forced him to do this, eventually leading to Zoom pretending to be unconscious, knowing that if he doesn't do this, Reiner truly will kill him, and with only faint traces of the poison being left behind in Zoom's breathing canals, he would lay there on the ground recuperating his strength, knowing that the team should be able to hold them off just long enough for him to be able to handle Reiner. And so, with that being the case, as Izuku would be hanging out with the rest of the villains who were distracting him, Reiner would rush Caitlyn, knocking her seemingly unconscious, with Rex saying, "Hey, what's the big idea?" Before suddenly, Reiner shooting into his nostrils would begin filling his entire body with the poison, with Rex starting to cough and waving at the air, trying to hit at something, but nothing would be there. Cage, knowing what this mean, would say, "Zoom, you need to..." But as he would leap into the air trying to use his weapon to shoot down Reiner, the bullets would simply go through him, with him flying towards his direction and poisoning him as well. Suddenly Trixie, creating an illusion of Zoom running in and defeating him, or scaring him, would catch Reiner off guard, who's like, "What?" Before then saying, "You think I'm gonna fall for that? I already took Zoom out." Rushing at Trixie before then using the same trick on her, with Tremor being upon the last ones left turning intangible, to which Reiner would say, "What are you gonna do? Protect the kid at that stage? If you don't undo that stage, I promise to fill that kid's airwaves with so much poison that the only thing he's gonna be good for is using his hands to turn things to gold for me." And so, Tremor, knowing he has no choice but to undo his quirk, or the kid will find himself in a vegetative state, he undoes it, as Reiner would fill his air ducts, choking the man, with Izuku yelling, "No! Reiner, how could you?" But Reiner would stand right in front of Izuku, to which suddenly Izuku would find himself inside of a barrier, Caitlyn weakly standing up and forming it, saying that she has a perfect counter, and so long as she's here, he won't be able to touch the kid. This would piss Reiner off, who, snapping back into his humanoid form, would grab his brass knuckles from his pocket before starting to smash at the barrier, which would start to crack, with a bit of poison seeping through the hole, until suddenly Zoom, rushing into the area, would start running circles around Reiner, forcing him to turn back into his normal humanoid form by force, with him completely unable to do anything to Zoom since he was running around him so fast he couldn't even swing a punch. This would lead Izuku to staring at Caitlyn, asking how he's gonna win. That Zoom looked weak. He didn't have his mask on and he practically looked green to the face, almost cartoonish, with him looking up to see that Caitlyn practically looked the same. They were both in dire condition. Izuku would look to the direction of Zoom, hoping that he can defeat Reiner, when suddenly Zoom would scream out, "Place your hand on the ground and turn the entire area to gold. Do it now, Izuku!" But Izuku, seeing this and scared of knowing that if he does this, he might never be able to undo this, he would freeze, completely unable to do a thing, with Zoom telling him that he can't think of a better way to go, saying that he's proud of him to go out there and become a hero. This is when Izuku, with tears coming out of his face, would proceed to slam his hands on the ground, with Caitlyn smiling behind him, who would say that she's proud of him, falling to the ground unconscious as she would turn to full gold, with Zoom, Reiner, Rex, Tremor, Trixie, and Cage following. All of them would be turned into gold, since the area that Izuku had to transform was long in range and there was no way for him to control it, since it was a burst of the moment type of thing, and it was an attack that he had just started learning alongside Zoom. But after this would be over and the dust would clear from Zoom running in the room at high speeds, Izuku would look around to see the entirety of the group that he had grown to consider a family was now all dead in his eyes, with Izuku looking to them and just breaking down into tears, thanking Zoom, with him passing out unconscious due to the bit of poison that had gone into his lungs. When he would wake up a few hours later, Izuku would go over to Zoom and Reiner's body, which was now in like a mix of cloud/humanoid form. And as Izuku would see him, he would punch at the golden statue, it hurting his fist, with Izuku not caring as he would stand up knowing what he had to do. Reiner told him to become a hero, and so Izuku would fulfill that promise to him. But that wasn't all. Izuku would swear in this moment that somehow he was going to turn them back to normal, before rushing to the other group to grab his things, where Izuku could see a banner saying, "Good luck, Izuku," alongside a bit of decorations that they were setting up in the room that Izuku wasn't allowed to go in. Izuku, seeing this, covering his mouth with his hands, would start to cry even harder, him realizing now that the group had planned to let him go. That must have been why Reiner acted. There wouldn't have been another reason for him to. He knows that while Reiner wasn't exactly a good guy and they didn't exactly have the best relationship, that he wouldn't have acted like this otherwise. And Izuku would feel horrible because on the one hand, his friends were going to let him go, but on the other, it was that very decision that led to all of their deaths. But as Izuku would think this in his heart, he would stop himself saying no, he was going to turn them back if it was the last thing he does. So, leaving the factory and jotting down some mental notes, Izuku would find himself in Hosu City, where making his way to the nearest hero that he could find, which in this case would be the pro hero Ingenium, Izuku tugging at the hero's leg would tell him that his name is Izuku Midoriya, and he was kidnapped a couple of years ago. Ingenium, hearing this, would immediately take the kid to police custody, where upon running some files and records and doing a DNA test, they would discover that this was the infamous Izuku Midoriya, capable of using the quirk Midas Touch. And with that being discovered, Izuku would almost immediately be flown back to Island, where after writing a brief police briefing, which Izuku would lie a lot about, considering the fact that he didn't want his, second family to be thrown into prison, which Izuku realized was probably the worst thing that he could have done, but he couldn't help himself. They had become like a second family to him. So, with Izuku giving all of this information to the cops, this would eventually lead Izuku to being flown straight back to Island, where once Izuku reaching the area, he would be greeted by Melissa Shield, who rushing to his side would wrap him in the tightest hug, saying that she thought she would never see him again. And David, looking towards him, would say that he's so happy to see him, that he had done everything he possibly could to find him. All Might looked for him for weeks whenever he wasn't taking care of hero missions. And Izuku would look at David, saying that he believes him, that he understands that the heroes had no way of locating him since the villains had used a clever strategy to get away. Izuku would say that their techniques were interesting to say the least, with David wondering if he knows about that. Izuku would say that the only reason he escaped was because a bomb had gone off dealing with a different villain organization, and it killed them all. He would ask where this was, but Izuku would lie, saying that he doesn't know. He wasn't focused on looking at his surroundings, but simply escaping. David would nod his head, saying that he understands, as this is when Izuku would lay back down in his real bed for the first time in years, laying onto it and finding himself feeling a strange bit of peace. Hearing the laughter and voices of his friends once more, Izuku would vow that the second that he's done with this nap, he was going to be making sure that they were turned back to normal as soon as possible. With that said, the very next day would come and go, with Izuku finding himself at the training grounds, with David entering at around the time Izuku would normally cut it short. But David, seeing the sweat dripping out of Deku's body, would ask why he's going so hard, with Izuku telling him that there's countless people counting on him to turn them back to normal. And one day, when he's a hero, he needs to make sure that he can undo the petrification on villains, his parents, and everyone he loves. David, hearing that, would nod understandingly, telling Izuku that he's not so sure about that dream of being a hero, but Izuku would cut him off before he even gets a chance to try to let Deku down easy. He would tell him that he does not care what he says or what anybody else says. He's going to be a hero. At that moment, Melissa would walk inside just going, "Deku," with him looking at her, smiling, and getting right back to the training, attempting over and over and over to undo his petrification and control the ability that he has to transform things to gold. This type of hardcore training would go on for the next 2 years, with Izuku eventually being thrown his 14th birthday party and being told by David that he wholeheartedly believes Izuku will be able to undo that petrification. And this is when he would wish Izuku a happy birthday, telling him to blow out those candles and wish for whatever his heart desires. Izuku would raise an eyebrow at this, wondering why make such a big deal out of this since everybody here knows what his biggest desire is. But nonetheless, the young boy would blow out the candles, wishing once more that he could undo the petrification. And after that would happen, Izuku would go to his room thanking everybody for the party, where once there, Izuku would hear a knock at the door. It would be Melissa who would say, "Izuku, how are you?" with Izuku packing his bag and Melissa asking him where he's going. Izuku would look at her with a smile before saying that he's gonna fulfill his dream of becoming a hero. He made a promise to somebody and he's not gonna break it. And Melissa would ask who he made that promise to. His parents, her, David? Who? But Izuku would tell her that that's not something important right now. What is that Izuku follows through with that promise. And she would tell Izuku that she believes in him and she'll support him with whatever he decides to do. But she would make him promise one more thing, saying that if he promised to be a hero and he's gonna fulfill that, he better promise her to come back safe. Izuku would look at her, smile, giving her a hug, before grabbing his briefcase of the pro hero costume he designed for himself for when the time was ready. And Izuku, boarding onto one of the planes that David had left unattended, would leave the island, using all of the stealth codes to bypass the security, with one thing flashing through Deku's mind: his UA entrance exam application, which had been denied with no reason. However, Izuku knew dang well why he was denied. It was because the government wants to keep him contained in a little box and make sure he's safe so they can continue to use Deku's ability to create gold to help out the economy, which Izuku found as a load of bull, because Izuku knew that he was only making the rich people get richer, meanwhile the poor got poorer, and Izuku was tired of it. It was time to really help the people that mattered. The everyday Joe being attacked in a villain attack, the families finding themselves defenseless in a fire, and even kids who would find themselves in the same situation Izuku did. He knows that he got off lucky, but there's people out there dealing with that as we speak. So Izuku piloting that ship straight to where Izuku knows best, his hometown, Izuku would get off the plane before leaving it at a random abandoned building where Izuku knew the government wasn't going to be able to track, and simply leaving that area. It's at this point that with his briefcase and with his hair now dyed, having done that on the plane with the cheap self-dyeing system that he got from the store, Izuku would now make his way around the area, wanting to see if he could find some abandoned warehouse where he could set up base. However, the moment that Izuku would find a place and go in through a busted window, Izuku seeing the rats, roaches, and even the homeless dude that was living there, Izuku would think to himself that this wasn't ideal, telling the man not to be scared, that he's simply just here to explore, before making his way to another level, and the man would say, "Get lost, kid, I don't want to share my home with you," flaring these strange orbs that were flying around him that, in all reality, couldn't do any damage to Izuku. They were really for show, since they packed the effectiveness of a rolled up paper ball. So as Izuku makes his way to the higher level, and he unpacks his pro hero costume thinking that it's about time he tried it on, Izuku would see a note slip out of the box with him picking it up and it reading, "Dear Izuku, I'm sorry I couldn't support you for so long, and I didn't make any effort to let you know that I was on your side all these years. I was just afraid that my funding would be cut. Melissa would have to grow up in a neighborhood where they wouldn't accept her quirklessness, and you would be taken away from me. I was a coward for all this time, but not anymore. I wholeheartedly support the decision you're going to make, and whether you turn out to be a hero or a vigilante or something in between, I will always be proud of you. Head to these directions and do what you have to do. Love, David." Izuku, crumpling that letter up and feeling tears welling up in his eyes, would think that he was a fool for thinking David had truly given up on him, but he didn't. He was supporting him from the shadows. Izuku, after wiping this off, would open that top window, not wanting to alert the man downstairs, and jumping down from it, Izuku would land, changing the consistency of the floor upon landing and turning it to liquid gold, before he would then put his hood on and make his way to the location David had sent him. Once there, Izuku's mouth would drop agape as he would think, there's no way. Seeing his childhood home, Izuku at this point would think that David is crazy before walking to the door and realizing that he didn't have a key. But the moment Izuku would get close, a random ray of energy would sense Izuku, kind of similar to what Edna Mode from The Incredibles uses, that like completely did like a retina scan or full body scan in Izuku's case, before saying welcome Izuku, opening the door with Izuku entering it and seeing a bunch of high-tech gadgets and a brand new costume laying on the table. Another note would be waiting for Izuku, with David telling him that if he's here, it's probably because he had gotten the other note. And knowing Izuku, he will be here. The note would then go on to read that he made this costume for Izuku after having suspicions Izuku would plan to do something like this, since after all, he is kind of like a father to him. So, the note would then go on to read to Izuku telling him to be careful and not to act like a villain, but to use the heroic compass that he has in his heart and to always make the right choice, to stand for justice. Telling him to get used to these new gadgets because he's going to be needing them. Izuku looking around at the room would then see that there's a training area, a bunch of guns and weapons that David had designed for Izuku, with the gun designed to use anywhere from non-lethal force to lethal force. All Izuku had to do was move a little lever on the gun and it determined the level of firepower that was being used. Izuku would think to himself that David is crazy, and then staring at his newfound costume, which would be jet black with a cool utility build that's the color of gold and a little chest plate area, kind of similar to what Batman has going on that says Golden Hero. 2 guns attached to each side, or holsters specifically, 2 areas to grab these 2 little golden blades that Izuku would turn into gold almost immediately upon making contact with them, and would be equipped with a mask that can help him breathe in bad situations that's very similar to the one that Izuku has in the original timeline. Izuku staring at all this would have a big grin on his face, as he would thank David in his mind, but know that he probably shouldn't give David any of the credit, since if the government found out, that wouldn't exactly be too good. And with that said, Izuku would spend the next few months making a real difference in the community, saving countless of lives and starting to cement himself as a bit of a urban legend. With us zooming into Izuku's latest villain encounter, as Izuku would have been jumping from rooftop to rooftop using his grappler, Izuku would find a woman about to get mugged by a man with a strange lizard quirk, who seemingly allows him to go feral in order to gain power. And as the man would be about to claw the woman in two practically, Izuku would throw a flashbang to the direction of the lizard, knowing that it would probably affect the woman. And he would be right on the money with that assessment. The woman would be shocked as the lizard would then go to attack her, sensing her as the nearest presence. But suddenly Izuku's voice modulator would echo, and it would go on to lead the lizard towards his direction. Which once the lizard would get close, Izuku grabbing a gun would proceed to shoot a couple of bullets at the lizard, which would do nothing seeing as it had armored skin. So, turning it to lethal force, Izuku would start shooting at areas that he knows the lizard would probably be weak at, before suddenly it would start charging at him as fast as possible. Izuku, thinking on his feet, would proceed to turn the ground into gold, with the lizard finding it difficult to grab a hold to the ground. And with that perfect opportunity, Izuku would take the moment to jab a toxin meant to knock out large villains, which would work almost immediately, forcing the man to revert back to normal, with his clothes being completely shredded, and Izuku tying him up, leaving a note saying, "Courtesy of your favorite vigilante." With that said, Izuku would then leap back into the air, with the woman saying, "Wait, what's your name?" And Izuku not saying anything back before just disappearing. Bro was aura farming in that moment. But suddenly, on top of the rooftop, Izuku would take his modulator mask off, and looking to the nearest rooftop, Izuku could see a man with a scarf flowing in the wind. Izuku, knowing exactly who this is, would think that he needs to go, before tossing a smoke bomb at the ground and shooting his grappling hook towards the direction of a nearby building. Immediately using this and maneuvering through this area that Izuku had known perfectly since he had grown up here, and also had taken the opportunity to become a vigilante over the last couple of months, would proceed to turn a corner so fast that Aizawa was shocked, and by the time that he got there, Izuku was gone. Using the darkness in the area and his suit, he would take advantage of this by making sure that he didn't illuminate it all in the night, and with Aizawa searching for him and then finally giving up, Izuku would come right out with a hoodie now on him, covering his face, with Izuku walking home as though he was just another casual thug. This, however, is when he would hear the scream of a woman going, "Get away from me!" As we would see Aizawa was actually approaching a woman and was gonna ask her to fake scream so that he could lure the anti-hero there. However, she was just frightened by his appearance and scruffy looking hair, believing Aizawa to be some sort of pervert. So with that and Izuku knowing that there's a chance Aizawa would probably be there too, he can't take the risk of allowing somebody to be in danger for even 10 more seconds. So using his grappling hook, Izuku would slide there as fast as humanly possible, with him arriving there and seeing that Aizawa was standing in front of the woman, with her screaming, "A hero! Help me, this pervert's trying to do stuff to me!" And as Izuku would stare at Aizawa, he would think that he's been duped, with him using his voice modulator to tell Aizawa that it was awfully smart of him to use a normal civilian as bait to lure him out here. He would ask him what exactly he wants with him, to which Aizawa, grabbing his scarf, would simply tell him that for now, he simply wants to talk. As Izuku, staring at the pro hero, would tell him that they can do that, but not here. That woman behind him is clearly scared. And so Aizawa, seeing the stature and the fact that the boy was using a voice modulator, would simply ask, "How old are you?" To which Izuku, staring back at him, would tell him that that is none of his concern. Aizawa, however, would tell him that that's the wrong answer, shooting his scarf towards the direction of Izuku as it would latch onto his arm, but almost immediately Izuku, knowing that that was not about to happen, would grab onto the scarf, turning it into liquid gold entirely. It would fall down onto the ground, dispersing everywhere, with the woman cupping some in her hand and running away, with Aizawa wondering what exactly that quirk is. Suddenly, Izuku, shooting his grapple at a roof, would tell Aizawa that he doesn't fight heroes, throwing down a smoke bomb and getting out of that area, with Aizawa unable to follow him, seeing as his scarf was taken out of commission. Aizawa, looking up into the air, would see Izuku jumping in the moonlit night, as he would wonder just what kind of man that is, not knowing the fact that under that hood and mask was a boy, a 14-year-old boy, desperate to make a change in the world. And so as Izuku would arrive back at camp, he would think to himself that that was a close one, tending to a scar that he had gotten in a previous battle with a random villain that had a strange ability similar to the Black Canary, having shot him into some glass with some of it penetrating Izuku's weak spot. As Izuku would do this, he would turn on the news, seeing that last night 3 more criminals were caught by this seeming vigilante, going on to explain that crime rates recently have been dropping a lot lately, with Izuku noting that that is true. He can't even remember the last time that he had actually gone out into his hometown and found a couple of villains within his first minutes. No, that's been rare for a while now, since lately Izuku's been having to board trains and go to neighboring towns at night where he runs his own villain patrols, since most heroes are usually out during daytime, not really paying attention to the nighttime lowlifes, which typically result in mugging, theft, and other miscellaneous things. As Izuku would finish his thoughts, the news outlet would begin reporting a different incident, the latest victim of the hero killer. And as Izuku would watch on and see the picture of the man deemed as the hero killer, as well as read the name of the hero injured, Izuku's eyes would widen as he would drop what he was holding for, well, dramatic effect. With that said, Izuku would read the name out loud. Ingenium. As Izuku would utter those words, he would remember his first time encountering the hero who would help Izuku without asking a single question. And Deku, knowing that this was a true hero, somebody who really did stand for justice, would feel that this is the final straw. He hadn't wanted to try to take on the hero killer, since that would most likely draw a lot of attention to himself. But with the hero killer's rampages going on more and more lately, Izuku can't deny the fact that he has to step in. So clenching his fists tightly and looking at the blade that he knows he's gonna have to use to take on the hero killer, Izuku would steel his resolve, standing up and swinging it a couple of times, as he would find himself training for hours before passing out on the mat, being way too exhausted to even take a shower. The next day would come and go, and with Izuku finally healing up and patching his injuries up for good, he would make his way towards the train station, which would take him directly to the city of Hosu. And for those of you wondering what's been going on UA side of things, it's pretty simple. Things have mainly stayed the same, with the only real change of note being that Aizawa would most likely pass away during the USJ incident, trying to defend his students, and with no Izuku there to use one for all to try to save the man. This would either lead to Aizawa getting very, very injured, or dead. And since I personally believe that Izuku making his way onto the battlefield right as the Nomu was crushing his skull, I think that Aizawa would most likely find himself dead. And even with that change happening in the story, I still don't believe that Yue would not take part in the sports festival, so that whole thing would take place and Iida's journey to Manuel's agency would still take place as well. So while Iida and Izuku were on the same bus making their way to Hosu, Izuku would take note of the boy who seems like something's troubling him. He has nothing but hatred and rage in his eyes. And as Izuku gets a better glimpse, looking up every now and then to make sure that Iida doesn't notice, he would quickly realize something. Wait, he looks just like Ingenium, having a mental image of what the man had looked like when his real picture was shown on the news, and realizing that this must be his kid brother trying to go and avenge him somehow, Izuku would walk over towards Iida before sitting down and telling him that he feels sorry about his brother. Iida, looking at the direction of the young kid who's about his age, would ask how he knows about that, with Izuku kind of covering his face a bit and saying that he's the spitting image of his brother. Iida for a moment could almost feel the hatred dissipate as he would think that he doesn't know who this kid is, but those words meant a lot to him. With no Izuku here in the original timeline, I don't see anybody at all in Class 1A caring about Iida, or even taking note of the fact that something's different about him, because no Izuku would likely mean that Uraraka and Iida don't even become friends. And with that said, Izuku would decide to tell him not to worry, that the heroes will catch the hero killer, before going back to his seat and being on his phone, kind of making sure Iida can't really get a good glimpse of his face. Iida, hearing those last words from Izuku, would clasp his hand together saying that the hero should have caught him already, so he's gonna do what his brother couldn't. And so, arriving at Hosu station, both of them would get off, going different locations, to which Izuku would make his way to a nearby rooftop, simply biding his time until he's sure that the cover of night would mask his presence. Once Izuku sees sunset, Izuku turns towards another nearby building pretty high up where he would see a man with blue hair and a hand covering his face, as well as the hero killer. And going from rooftop to reach that location, by the time that he would get there, it would be far too late. The hero killer, Kurogiri, and Shigaraki would be gone, with their encounter that we get in the original going down just like in canon, until eventually after Stain would decline their offer, Shigaraki, feeling angered at his declination, would release a horde of Nomus in the city, trying to outshow the hero killer. Izuku, seeing this mob of random villains appear, would think to himself that that has to be the doing of one of those three, and so, lunging towards the direction of one of the nearest Nomus, which was about to attack a couple walking through an alleyway as a shortcut, Izuku, lunging in, would throw a kick as hard as possible, but the Nomu would simply tank it, then grabbing him by the leg and tossing him into a wall. Izuku could feel his body ricochet off before he would cough out, and then with his modulated voice say, "Get out of here," to the people. They would do just that, with Izuku immediately making the connection that this isn't somebody using a quirk, this is a Nomu, recognizing it by its trademark brain that's completely outshowing. So Izuku, knowing that that thing is not even a human, would decide that it's about time he was able to use his quirk on something. And so, lunging across the wall and wall jumping by jumping from one wall to the next one, Izuku dropping a smoke screen would blind the Nomu, with Izuku using an infrared vision device to lunge towards the direction of the Nomu. However, it having a sensory quirk would know exactly where Deku was, punching Deku in the side of the ribs, sending him crashing into a dumpster. Izuku, feeling the pain, would start to be like, "Ah, what the?" As the Nomu would inch closer and closer to him, Izuku suddenly would outstretch his hand as the Nomu would punch towards him, as it immediately turns into solid gold. Izuku, in this moment, looking at that thing, would then proceed to think to himself that that is a monster, before injecting himself with this device that kind of works like a quick-acting Tylenol for the pain that he was feeling in his ribs. Izuku would think that he's going to feel that for a few weeks, before then getting back up and deciding that he needs to find more Nomu or the hero killer, whichever comes first. So jumping from rooftop to rooftop, Izuku would begin looking, but it wouldn't take long as an explosion would go off, and Izuku, seeing the chaos a Nomu would cause, would decide that he has to act. But seeing a horde of heroes arriving, Izuku knows that he should not get involved in that. But seeing that they were clearly struggling to handle this Nomu that has multiple quirks and even seemingly, according to reports, was capable of giving someone like All Might trouble, Izuku would think to hell with that. Even if he has to go to jail, he's saving all these people. But it's at this point that suddenly the Endeavor agency would arrive with an icicle shooting towards the direction of Nomu, and Izuku seeing this would smile, knowing that he can handle other things. He would then lunge towards the direction of a different Nomu, knowing that it was attacking civilians, but just as he could see heroes acting, Izuku turning towards his left would hear a blood-curdling scream, which would be none other than Iida, and Izuku, noting that that was definitely that boy he met on the bus, would rush to save the blue-haired boy, stopping the kill blow that Stain was about to land and pushing Stain away so he could have a standoff with him. This would then leave the hero killer licking his blade, saying that that boy is worthless and he shouldn't be allowed to live. He's a fake hero, telling Izuku to get out of his way before his blade has to pass judgment on him as well. And Izuku, knowing that Stain was serious in this moment, would simply smile, knowing that he's ready for him. Grabbing his 2 golden blades, Izuku would wave the signal of "come at me," and so the 2 of them lunging at each other would begin to do a sword clash. But it would become painfully obvious that Stain's skill and time that he's been doing this for just completely outclasses Izuku. So Izuku, creating some distance between them, would then grab a gun out of his holster, shooting a couple of rounds at Stain, which Stain would narrowly manage to avoid, before then lunging into the direction of Izuku underneath his side of range. Izuku, noting that Stain is extremely skilled, would slash at the ground, stopping the hero killer from closing the gap, with Izuku continuing to shoot rounds and then throwing a smokescreen telling him that he won't be able to fight him now, not blinded. But Stain, after closing his eyes, would simply start to sense the presence, and immediately hearing the noise of a blade whooshing through the air, something that Stain has heard so many times before, he would counter the attack, telling him that while he is skilled, he lacks experience and conviction, before swinging Izuku's blade out of his hand and then using his blade to nick Izuku. This would get a little bit of blood off of him, and with Izuku knowing that the hero killer has some sort of quirk that paralyzes heroes, Izuku would quickly make contact with Stain before he has the chance to leap away, with Stain's entire body turning to gold, and Izuku could feel all of his muscles contract in that instant. He would then think to himself that this is bad. Unless this paralyzation effect wears off quickly, he's gonna be in a world of trouble. And as he's on the ground laying there with Stain having been defeated, this is when Iida's effect would wear out, as he would walk over towards him, asking him if he's that boy that he met on that bus, recognizing him by that jet black dyed hair. Izuku, looking towards Iida, would tell him that if he is, what's he planning to do? Iida would tell him that that was his fight and he had no right to step in the way. And so, being a vigilante, he's gonna report this to the police, and he's gonna have to answer for his crimes of vigilantism. Izuku, knowing that that was definitely gonna be his answer, would tell Iida to do what he must, starting to feel a bit of feeling in his legs, as Izuku would pretend to be paralyzed for the duration of time, with Iida eventually calling forth an ambulance and a patrol cruiser, which would arrive to say nothing but a small note saying, "Sorry, can't get caught yet." With Iida crumpling that paper up, and rage would fill his heart since he's still stuck up on that idea of avenging his brother with his own hands. And with Izuku leaving the area knowing that the hero killer Stain was now taken care of, and that was just another person added to the list that he was one day going to have to unpetrify, Izuku on top of a rooftop would heal to his injuries, and that flesh wound that Stain had given him would look up at the sky asking if he's doing the right thing. But eventually, getting his composure together, Izuku would decide that he's going to have to change that hair color of his again, knowing that Iida was probably going to be giving a full detailed report to the police on his size, eye color, and everything, so now he's also going to get some contacts. Izuku would stay there in Hosu for the night, biding his time in an abandoned building, with the next day him making his way towards a random store which sells a bunch of little anime gadgets. He would use these cool little purple eye contact lenses, as he would also proceed to buy some cosplay wig. Putting that thing on, Izuku making his way towards this train station and buying a brand new anime fan hoodie, which would probably be some sort of Dragon Ball Z orange thing that makes him pop out like a sore thumb. Izuku would board the train, making his way home, not being caught by the police or anybody, since nobody would have been able to make heads or tails about his appearance. So with that being the case, and Izuku feeling that this mission was completed, he would return home, healing himself up and training for the next time he has to fight somebody, knowing that he needs to work on his swordsman abilities most of all, because Stain completely outclassed him. His movements were so efficient, lacking any sort of semblance of wasted movements, and Izuku found that impressive. Though a villain, he was somebody that Izuku strives to be like when it comes to his close hand-to-hand combat abilities. And with Izuku's latest mission finally over, Izuku would rest and continue taking more missions, making a real difference in superhuman society, with this myth very much so leading a lot of villains to not act at night, because Izuku's methods were a bit more brutal than the heroes, to say the least. Considering that his friends, the Sinister Six, had beaten one lesson into him, and that was that villains can't exactly be taken out the normal route. You gotta put fear into their hearts. So Izuku taking that message to heart would practically almost eliminate crime rates in the small towns that he would go to, having cleared out about 3 or 4 over the past year. And as the months would pass, events in the My Hero story would come and go, with the Forest Training Camp arc coming, the Camino Ward incident, and eventually the All Might vs All for One fight, which Izuku, watching as it's being nationally televised, would watch on feeling helpless, knowing that if he was at the battlefield, he could help his Uncle Might by simply turning that damn villain into a statue of gold. That entire area would finally be safe with no threat, but Izuku couldn't risk making his way towards that direction, knowing it to be a nationally televised event and getting caught. So just watching with a clenched fist, hoping for the best, Izuku would watch on as All Might would come out victorious, landing the United States of Smash on All for One and bringing the villain to his knees. After seeing that defeat, Izuku would feel inspired, knowing that he needs to make an even bigger difference in Japan, considering that now their biggest hero was officially gone. So continuing his life making a difference in Japan, Izuku would eventually find himself at Mustafu, Japan, a couple of months since the Camino Ward incident. And so we zoom into Izuku in daytime, making his way towards a coffee shop where Izuku would plan to simply bide his time and relax with a little bit of light reading. And while Izuku would be on his way there wearing a olive-colored hoodie with black pants and some white-colored trainers, Izuku would suddenly feel a small bump as he would walk past an abandoned-looking alleyway. Looking down at his feet, Izuku could see a small girl, and looking into her eyes, Izuku would see a look that he knows all too well. That's the look of someone desperately crying for help. So as Izuku stares at the little girl, he would suddenly turn his gaze towards the man in the alleyway, which would be that of Overhaul, who would say, "Eri, don't bother the man. Come here already, we need to go home." And as Izuku would hear that and know the situation, assessing it almost perfectly, Izuku would start to make small talk, saying, "Oh, you must be your dad, right?" Overhaul would nod, saying that he is, telling Eri to come along now, as Izuku would say, "Wow, her hair is really pretty. Where do you guys take her to get that done? I have a little sister at home and I'd love to know." Overhaul, not one for the small talk, would give him a dry answer before staring at Eri in the eyes and signaling to her that he was going to take his gloves off. Izuku, noticing this, would be quick to understand the situation, since when he was a child, he would use quirk dampening gloves to help him control his ability. So knowing that this man must have an ability that requires physical contact with stuff, would brace himself for impact, grabbing onto Eri tightly and looking at her very quickly, signaling to her that everything will be okay. But as Eri could feel the overwhelming killing intent from Overhaul, she would try to rip away from Deku, leading him to squeeze her tighter as he would leap into the air, with spiked stones flying at his direction, to which Izuku would narrowly manage to evade the deadly ones. This would pierce his knee and leg, causing him to fall down to the ground, with him thinking to himself that he has to do it. Even in public, he has to save this little girl. How many times at the beginning of his capture by the Sinister Six did Izuku wish that a hero would lunge inside and save him from these people? Izuku's gonna make sure that this little girl doesn't have to go through another tortured night again. So, placing his hand on the stones that had just come flying at him, with Overhaul telling him that it's too late for him, suddenly the entire area would turn to gold, with Overhaul finding himself in a petrified state alongside nearby buildings, trash, dumpsters, you name it. If it was nearby, it was turned to gold. So by the time that Izuku could land, Izuku, seeing that the entire area was clearly going to call attention, would rush with Eri by his side, telling her to come along. The two would run out of people's point of view, with some people signaling to heroes, and with the heroes arriving and seeing the scene, they would be stunned. As we would then zoom in back towards Izuku and Eri, who had made their way towards another area where the heroes couldn't find them, Izuku would finally ask Eri what her name is and who that man was. Eri would go on to tell him that her name was Eri and he was Overhaul. before then going on to explain that he had her in his possession for years and had, in her words, had been using her to make some strange thing. She would describe the feeling of dying and being reborn again and again and again, and as Izuku could hear the story coming out of Eri, he would feel rage fill his eyes as he could see the little girl bursting out into tears with her telling him every detail. Izuku would suddenly put his finger over her mouth, telling her not to say anything else, as he would tell her that she's never gonna have to deal with that again, smiling kindly towards Eri, telling her that now he'll take her to the police, and once there they can find her family or find some proper caretakers for her. But Eri, looking down, would see that she doesn't have a family. This would serve to make the somber mood even worse, and as Izuku would stare at Eri, Eri would look at his injury saying, "Oh no, you're hurt because of me." Izuku, looking towards Eri, would tell her that it's not a big deal, that he deals with this stuff all the time. After all, he's a hero. Eri, hearing this, would light up, saying that that's why he saved her, and Izuku would say absolutely, before going on to inform Eri that they need to make their way towards the police station. However, this is when Eri, grabbing onto his leg, would say that she doesn't want to go, that she wants to stay with him. And Izuku, hearing that and looking down at the little girl whose expression was begging for him to agree to that, he would pat her on the head before saying fine, he won't do that. But if she wants to stay with him, she's gonna have to listen exactly to what he says. He would go on to tell her to hold his hand and pretend that she's his little sister. Don't say anything, don't look at anyone, and try not to stand out until they make their way home. Eri would nod, looking at Izuku, with him telling her that he understands if she can't pull this off to perfection, but if they get caught, she will go to the police. So Eri, knowing that these are the stakes, would follow Izuku, doing exactly what he had told her, with the only interaction that Izuku had to deal with on his way home being an old lady who would say that his little sister's so cute. Izuku, hearing that, would thank her, and eventually we would see the two making their way towards Izuku's house, where once inside, Eri would look stunned, going, "Whoa, this is awesome. Is this really your house, mister?" Eri would ask, as Izuku would reply saying that it is, going on to explain to her to tell him more about the story. What exactly was that man making? She would say that she doesn't know, but whatever it was, she can't imagine it's good, since he was using her power, saying that her quirk is dangerous. She would point at her horn, with Izuku not understanding what she means, but this is when Eri would go on to, as a child, explain that one time when she was a kid, she ended up touching both of her parents and they disappeared. Izuku, hearing that, would be shocked, saying that she must have a quirk similar to what he has, a quirk that she wasn't able to control and eventually ended up causing damage to the people that she loved. Izuku, looking at Eri, would say not to feel bad, that it's not her fault. Quirks can sometimes be unpredictable. After all, he did the same thing when he was younger. He would turn to Eri, saying that when he was a kid, laughing, when he and his parents were walking by, they were swinging him when suddenly they turned to gold. Eri would say, "What? Gold? Was it pretty?" And Izuku would say that it was, but it wasn't really that pretty. Going on to explain that they've been stuck like that since he can remember, and he's been trying to fix it. He would look at Eri, telling her that he will fix it, and if she can somehow learn to control her quirk, she can fix it too. Izuku would ask her to demonstrate how it works, and as Eri would look at Izuku, there would be a slight sign of fear there. Izuku would look at her, saying not to worry, that he doesn't mean to pressure her. And this is when he would pretty much just stay with the little girl, patting her head until she would eventually fall asleep. Izuku, looking at Eri on the couch, would think that he's not exactly the best caretaker for her, and he needs to get her to the police or tell David about her. Maybe he can help. But as Izuku would start to think about what Eri's quirk must have done to make them disappear, he would think that it was probably a teleportation quirk. But why would somebody experiment with that? And as Izuku would think all these things in his head, suddenly an idea would come to his mind. Remembering the description that Eri gave to her quirk, Izuku would think, there's no way, what if she's the missing piece of the puzzle that I've been searching for? Izuku thinking to himself that if his quirk can undo it, maybe hers can. But knowing that this is a lot to ask out of a child, Izuku would put this thought at the back of her mind. With the next day Eri waking up to the smell of eggs and bacon, he would scream, "Eri, how do you want your eggs?" To which she would say, "Huh? but Izuku would simply give her some sunny side eggs with a piece of toast, going on to tell her to eat up, that she needs to eat to get big and strong. She would do just that, with Izuku putting some cartoons on for the day, all the while he would be in the other room training, throwing punches and sword attacks. Eri would eventually make her way there and ask Izuku what he's doing. Seeing Izuku training, she would ask if he does this every day, and Izuku would nod, going on to explain that he does, before grabbing a small little toy that he had bought from the dollar store in bulk and turning it into gold, trying to turn just the foot, just the hand, just the head, and just the legs. Since Izuku does this every day to help himself control his petrification effect, so that if he's trying to turn one specific object on the battlefield to gold, it doesn't have the radius effect that it's been having since he was a kid. Izuku wonders why it is that it works like that, but this is when his thoughts would be interrupted by Eri, who would ask if she can train too. Izuku would laugh before telling her to punch like this and kick like this, and Eri would start trying to do it just like Deku, with him laughing at her failed attempts. This is when eventually Izuku would sit her down and ask her if her quirk has ever been called Rewind. And with Eri hearing that name, she would suddenly get a image of Overhaul. With Izuku feeling so sorry that he had even brought it up, he would comfort the little girl, telling her that it's okay. Overhaul will never come back again. He's been petrified, turned to solid gold, and he'll never be able to undo that. Eri, looking at Izuku, would ask if his quirk is like hers, and if it hurts people. But Izuku would stay silent before then telling her that it could hurt people, but just like her quirk, it can also help people. Eri, hearing that, would ask if he's serious about that, since all she's ever heard from Overhaul is that she's a curse, and he's putting that to good use. Izuku would look at Eri, rubbing his hands on her head before saying that it's okay, and that their quirks can be used for much good. He would go on to ask Eri if she can potentially demonstrate using her quirk, and that he can help her start working on it. They can take as long or as little as they need. He would tell Eri that he's in no rush at all. And so, with the days passing, Izuku and Eri would both focus on trying to control their quirks, with Izuku kind of finding himself as almost a perfect mentor for Eri, having gone through the hurdles that she would have gone through with the fear of turning everything, well, back in time and having everything disappear. This training would take a long time, considering the fact that Eri's horn was directly tied to how much rewind she could use, and when Izuku would make that connection, he would tell Eri that the way it functions is that she stores up that energy and releases it, and with her hearing that, they would eventually do this training once a month, or no, once every 2 weeks. So with that being said, he would task her with unpetrifying little tools or little toys that Izuku would hand to Eri. And with months passing and Eri finally understanding how it works, she would smile, undoing the petrification effect, to which Deku would throw her up into the air, leaping with joy, catching her saying, "She did it, she did it, she did it." A smile would appear on Izuku's face as he would think that Eri can undo all the damage of the years that he's caused. He would immediately think of one place, that abandoned facility he had fled from so many years ago. He would wonder if they're all still in one piece. And then looking to Eri, Izuku would ask if she can do him one favor. Eri would look at him smiling, saying that of course, to which Izuku would say that he needs her help and would ask if she can undo the petrification on humans if she's ready. She would look up then down before saying that she might be, to which Izuku, getting a memory of what she was like when he had first met her to now, would think that it's a night and day difference. The kind of training style and the way that he's been kind of raising this little girl has done wonders for her, and has helped her a lot with the trauma that she experienced with Overhaul. So, as Izuku would hear this answer from Eri, he would smile, passing her a coat and putting his own on. This is when we would watch the duo make their way to a train and make their way to the exact factory where he had left his previous family. Once there, Izuku would walk inside with a new appearance than the one that we were used to. Izuku had dyed his hair to match that of Eri, so the story of him and her being siblings would be a lot more believable. And entering the area, Eri would ask if it's even safe to go in there. Izuku would tell her that it's okay, he'll protect her. And as the two of them would step inside, Eri, looking inside, would say that it's so much different on the inside. With Izuku bursting down or kicking down a door that had previously been shut by Reiner, Izuku would make his way towards the group, telling Eri that she can start with him, as Eri would look towards the direction of Zoom or Hunter before closing her eyes and using her quirk on him. This is when suddenly Hunter, having the petrification effect undone as well as the poison effect undone thanks to Eri's rewind, would breathe in deeply, then looking towards Izuku, who has grown up so much. He was so much bigger than the last time he had seen him. And staring at him, he would say, "Kid, you did it, didn't you?" To which Izuku would look at him saying that he didn't, she did. He would look at his leg only to see a little girl saying, "There's no way we've been petrified and you became a father, right?" But Izuku looked at him and said, No, that's not my daughter. With Zoom telling him that it better not have been, asking how long they've been out of it. He would go on to explain that it's been a couple of years, with Hunter looking down at Eri and thanking her for saving him. She would say that it's no problem at all, and it's at this point that she would go on to do the same to every single remaining member of the Sinister Six. After all of them, including Reiner, would be unpetrified, Izuku would stare daggers at Reiner, who's staring back at Izuku, aware of what must have happened, that after the petrification Izuku must have even undone it to him. He would be unable to even look Izuku properly, kind of staring away, with Zoom looking at Reiner, telling him that while what he did was horrible, he should have expected it. After all, they're villains. He would then turn to him, telling him that if he ever tries to pull that thing again, he will kill him. And Reiner, looking at Zoom, understanding what he means, he would simply nod, telling him that he swears to never do that again, before kind of under his breath kind of muttering that he's sorry. Izuku knows that that's just how Reiner is, and he would think to himself that it's whatever. I mean, after all, what did he expect? He's a villain. And as Izuku would sit there, guard down, just happy to see his friends back to normal again, this is when suddenly Caitlyn would rush him, wrapping her arms around him and shoving this man's face straight into her, well, you know the word. Would leave Izuku's face to turning bright red, since the last time that had happened to him was when he was 12 years old. So by the time Izuku would pull his face out of there, finally breathing, he would say that he missed Caitlyn too. She would smile, saying that she knew the boy was gonna free them all. And this is when all of them would go on to ask, "So, who's the girl?" To which the little girl would say, "Hi, my name's Eri." And after explaining the situation, with Izuku saying that after they had been turned to gold, he returned to the island, trained, and became a vigilante, all of them would say that they knew he had it in him, going on to explain that Izuku back then used to talk a whole lot about justice and how he was going to be a hero. Izuku would roll his eyes, going on to explain that he had no choice. The government didn't exactly want to let him do what he pleased, so he decided to make his difference in his own way. And after looking at the boy, Zoom would smile, asking Izuku just how strong he's gotten, before all of them would look towards Izuku and ask to have a little bit of a sparring session. Eri, who's sitting in the midst of all this, seeing these people talk as though they're just old friends, would have a smile on her face, as this is when suddenly Izuku and Zoom would square off to face each other. Zoom, now preparing to use his quirk, would tell Izuku that he's not planning to hold back, and that he wants to see exactly just how much he's grown and what kind of fighter he's become. Izuku would nod, telling him to go all out, and in an instant, Zoom would be right in front of Deku, throwing one of his high-speed punches, which Deku would narrowly be able to evade, using the muscle memory he's attained after facing off against countless villains. And so, then going in to land a counter-strike, Izuku would miss, hitting nothing but plain air, with Zoom being underneath his side of vision. He would then try to hit Izuku with an uppercut, to which Izuku would respond by placing both of his hands underneath his chin to take on the force of the impact. Izuku, being shot up into the air, would use his feet to propel himself off of the roof and lunge towards the direction of Zoom. Zoom, however, would see this coming from a million miles away and react to Izuku accordingly, throwing a kick which would land, sending Izuku crashing into a pile of cardboard boxes. Eri, watching this, would be like, "Why are they fighting?" To which the girl, Caitlyn, would go on to say that they're just old friends and they're just playing. She would say, "Oh, okay," as she starts saying, "Izuku, you can do it." And while he's, over here fighting for his life, basically, while Zoom is literally trying to destroy him with everything he has, Izuku suddenly would realize that fighting Zoom in a hand-to-hand combat stage is not his brightest idea. And so, holding his own against Zoom for a couple of seconds, Izuku would realize that in order to beat him, he's gonna need to slow him in his tracks. So, as Zoom would rush towards him, about to land the finishing blow, saying he's gotten good, but he's still not on his level, and Zoom would be swinging both arms back and forth, getting closer and closer, Izuku, who's now on the ground, would turn the ground to liquid gold, with Zoom losing his footing, before then transforming that liquid gold to solid gold, and everything making contact with the liquid gold would also turn to to gold, meaning that Zoom would be completely petrified, stuck in his running stance. To which Izuku, looking to Eri, would say, "Eri, I'm really sorry to ask this of you, but can you undo that?" And she would say, "Sure, that was really fun." So going over to him, she would use her rewind quirk, making her horn grow ever so slightly smaller, with Izuku smiling at Eri, thanking her. After this would happen, everyone would begin praising Eri and not even Izuku for having won his match against Zoom, with them all kind of expecting it. I mean, they would have been pretty disappointed if Izuku, after all these years of training by himself, with their help mind you, wasn't able to defeat Zoom. So with that being said, as everybody's praising Eri, saying how awesome she is, and she's over there smiling, just loving it, this is when suddenly Tremor would begin cracking a joke, saying that the little kid that they had kidnapped so long ago grew up and did the same thing to somebody else, with the rest of the group laughing, finding some strange irony behind that joke if it was true, but obviously since they all know it's not, they would all just have a good time about it. Everybody would think that that was funny except for Izuku, who, hearing that, would start to think to himself if maybe he is doing that. Is he really just using Eri just like Overhaul was to attain his selfish goals, the one thing that he couldn't do? But as he would think about this and look at his friends who were all smiling and back to be together again, Izuku would put that in the back of his mind, simply enjoying his time with the group before, after a couple of hours, asking what exactly they're gonna do now. With the group looking at him smiling, with Zoom walking over towards Izuku, ruffling his hair just like he used to do in the old days, and telling him that what they're gonna do is what they're gonna do, but not to worry about it, considering that they're not exactly the same villains they once were, so he doesn't have to worry about them. But Eri, hearing this in the background, would say, "You're villains?" To which Izuku would say, no, they didn't really mean that. It's a bit of a joke. It's an inside joke, right, Zoom?" Zoom would say, "Yeah, that's right, kid. We're not actually villains. We're just some childhood best friends of the boy." And so with that being said, Izuku would then go on to hear them tell him that they're pretty much just planning to live things peacefully, I guess you could say. They enjoy that calm life that they got to have while they had Izuku in their possession. And honestly, they don't really feel like the life of you-know-what suits them anymore. Izuku looks at them, smiles, and says that they could join him, that they don't have to go live a leisurely life. He could use some backup in his vigilanteism. But as they would stare at Izuku, they would say that that's not really their line of work. This then earning a defeated look from Izuku, to which Zoom, noting this, would tell the kid that he can call them anytime, and that they'll always be there to lend him a hand. If he ever runs into a villain that he can't quite handle on his own, he can count on the Sinister Six to be there to back him. So Izuku, hearing that, having been given this number on a little piece of paper, Izuku would smile, waving his friends off as they would leave into the distance, Caitlyn using her barrier quirk to float them up into the air, with Tremor using his Dementor powers to float them as fast as possible, a combo that Izuku hadn't seen since he was taken from that island so many years ago. And with that said, Izuku now standing there looking to the direction of Eri, he would see a glint in her eye, to which she would say that those people were so nice, saying that he's so lucky to have such awesome friends. With Izuku looking to Eri, then at the sky, seeing them leave, and say, "Yeah, you're right. I do have good friends." And it's here where I gotta ask, boys, how are you guys feeling about this story? Because I have been taking my sweet time with this. I've been working on this project for like a week, and I can't tell you guys how much genuine joy I've gotten from this series. So if I somehow manage to entertain you while you're washing dishes, cleaning your house, or finishing up a shift at work, then it would genuinely mean the world to me if you guys could like this video so I could continue making stuff like this, where I just pour so much time and energy into a video and I just really flesh out the story. So yeah, boys, do me that quick favor, but let's get back into the story. After this, Izuku would return back to home base with Eri, and once there, Izuku would look at her, going on to explain that there's just one more place they need to go visit. Eri, looking at Izuku, would smile, asking just where they're going this time, and Izuku would tell her that it's gonna be somewhere fun, something that he's sure she's gonna love. After all, he remembers loving it more than anything when he was a kid. And so with that being said, the very next day, Izuku and Eri board the same ship that Izuku would use to make it here, and once he does that, Izuku would turn on the camouflage feature, to which he would then fly towards the direction of where Island should technically be floating around, since the island never stops moving to make it very difficult for people to get onto the island. But since Deku had lived there for years and is practically a genius thanks to being raised around Melissa and David, Izuku would find it in no time, with them arriving a few hours later and Izuku disabling the security system just for a minute while he enters the stratosphere. Once doing so, Izuku would land in the pod area, and once there, Izuku would help Eri out of the plane, to which he would proceed to tell her that they're gonna have a fun day, but first, they need to make a stop. On their way there, Eri would say, "Whoa, look at that!" And she starts pointing out all the cool things, the heroes, the costumes, the people, the ice cream, and Izuku just looks at her, promising that he was gonna take her in less than an hour. So Eri, with a big smile, would walk happily with Izuku, as holding her little hand, Izuku would just feel so much joy. This, however, is when Izuku would finally make his way towards the David estate, and entering the home, Izuku would sit in the living room wanting to make some sort of dramatic appearance. And so, as soon as Izuku hears keys jingle, he goes to Eri, goes, hey, stay quiet, stay quiet. To which the both of them go a little quiet, and Izuku and Eri both sit there kind of posing, with Melissa entering the house to let her to shriek, going, "Who are you?" Until suddenly, looking at those eyes that are unmistakable, seeing the height, the scruffy looking hair, she knows exactly who this is. She would rush to Izuku, saying that he looks so different, and give him the biggest hug, with her going on to say that she knew he would be back, with tears beginning to build up in her face, with Izuku reminding her that a promise is a promise. And this is when she, looking to the direction of Eri, who was right behind Izuku, would ask who the little cutie is, with Izuku going to explain that she's Eri and she's something like a little sister to him, before beginning to explain how it is that he found her in child-friendly terms. However, before Izuku could even get halfway through the story, David's voice would ring out from the background as it would say, "Whoa, don't start the story without me," to which Izuku, turning to David, would say, "David, I'm so glad to see you." He would say that he's so sorry for not believing that he had, put some faith into him, and David would tell him that there's no need for that this is a happy reunion, to which he would go on to tell Izuku that he was pretty smart for trying to disable the security so that it wouldn't register him arriving. But this is when David would go on to reveal that the reason that he's here now is because he had actually seen Izuku through the security system, that the codes have changed since it has been a few years after all, and Izuku, realizing that that probably would have been the case, would give himself a little facepalm, to which David would laugh, saying that that's the only reason he made it here. This is when Izuku would go on to give the kid-friendly version of the story of Eri, which they would understand reading through the lines, with after this happening, he having like a little bit more of like a reunion scene with them before finally getting serious and saying that he's here on the island for more than just a meet and greet. He goes on to explain to them that he's here to finally fulfill a promise he made a long time ago, with Izuku saying that he needs to see his parents. However, David would go on to reveal that he's sorry to hear that because his parents are actually no longer on the island. Izuku, hearing that, would be stunned, going, "What do you mean, David?" To which he would go on to tell him that his parents were actually taken by the Pro Hero Commission. A little bit after Izuku had left, the Pro Hero Commission wasn't exactly too happy that Izuku had left in pursuit of becoming a vigilante, and with them having tracked his efforts and wanting to get him back, they figured that the best possible way to do it was to hold his parents captive, so that Izuku would be forced to come to them, not the other way around. That's the reason Izuku hasn't had to encounter any run-ins with the government, or really any run-ins with heroes. Izuku, hearing this, would nod, saying that that makes sense, before gritting his teeth and fist and simply thinking to himself that that's stupid. He could have freed his parents from that curse now, but thanks to the government, he has no choice but to go back to them. David would look to Izuku, telling him that he's sorry about that, saying that he knows how much Izuku wants to continue this. But he would tell him that so long as Izuku's fine, he can always go to his parents and do that whenever. However, Izuku, knowing that his parents have been stuck in this petrified state for years, would think to himself that it's not fair for him to live out his dream while they're stuck and are unable to even live their own lives. Izuku would feel a bit upset, but he would decide that he's going to give this vigilanteism up, considering that he wouldn't be able to call himself a hero if he can't save those closest on him, those who would be depending on him. So, with a disheartened look, Izuku would tell David that he'll agree to turn himself into the Hero Commission, and David would nod, telling him that he's proud of his choice, and that his parents would be happy to hear that. This is when Melissa, noticing the tension in the room that was building due to the conversation, would chime in, saying that Izuku must be some sort of wizard, considering the fact that he'd returned on a perfect day. Izuku would say, "Oh yeah, is that because you guys are having another expo?" And she would nod, going on to explain to Izuku that that's exactly it. Izuku would say that he noticed and that he's pretty excited to show Eri around. He would invite Melissa along, saying that she'd probably be a better guide since he hasn't been here in years, and she would nod, going on to agree to following them, to which we would now see Eri, Melissa, and Izuku walking around Island being shown cool expos, buying ice cream, cotton candy, and all sorts of snacks. Eri would take pictures with countless random little heroes that she would find really cool looking, and this is when eventually, after a few hours would pass, and the three would be walking around the island having explored about 1/3 of it, this is when Eri would say that Izuku and Melissa look like Mama and Papa, and them hearing this would earn a little bit of a blush from them, with each other kind of noticing how much the other's grown, not really having taken note of that since, they had just seen each other in so long, and they were more focused about the reuniting rather than their physical appearances. So with that being said, Melissa would kind of have to admit that Izuku is definitely grown into his own, and Izuku seeing Melissa, well, just kind of reinforces that crush that he had had on her since he was a kid. That said, Izuku would laugh at this, saying that she's hilarious, to Eri of course, as they would continue showing her around, when all too suddenly cameras and reporters would all swarm a certain person, All Might, having arrived to the island alongside his students of UA. This is when Melissa would detract from them, rushing to All Might and saying, "Uncle Might!" To which Izuku would wish he could do the same since he also considers All Might his uncle, but knowing that that boy that he had just gotten a glimpse of was there, he thinks that that probably wouldn't have been the best thing to do, and catching a slight glimpse of Katsuki Bakugo, Izuku would reinforce that notion even more, to which Izuku would walk away with Eri, blending into the crowd and continuing to show her around the island, would eventually lead to 3 or 4 hours passing, until eventually Izuku and Melissa both getting ready in their same rooms, with Izuku's room being right next to Melissa, would eventually lead Melissa to putting on her earrings while she would ask Izuku a question, why Izuku had left earlier. Izuku would go on to explain his little run-in with Iida a few months back, explaining that after he had saved him, the boy pretty much repaid his kindness by trying to get him thrown in jail. Melissa hearing this and seeing the look in Izuku's eyes of irritation would then say that she understands why he didn't talk or, get closer, seeing as that could have been problematic. And she would say sorry for inviting them. To which Izuku would say that it's not like she literally invited them, All Might probably did that. But this is when Melissa would reveal that she had invited the entirety of Class 1A to the actual Expo Party. Izuku hearing that would kind of have a little bit of a facepalm, to which Izuku would follow up by saying that it should be fine, seeing as he's turning himself in tomorrow anyways. As he and Melissa would look at each other with a bit of silence in the air, with them finishing getting ready when they would eventually meet up with the group. This is when, after introductions would be had and all the girls would finish arriving, all of them would be about to join the rest of the party when suddenly everything would turn dark. With Izuku recognizing this with the security system having been taken over, that only happens upon a reset. And the second that the lights would turn back on, Izuku would go rushing looking to the direction of the main party area, seeing that the heroes were now caught and that the robots have now been turned against everybody else. Izuku would look on in anger, thinking to himself that this just had to happen the day that he had returned to the island, before sighing and thinking that he's glad. At least he'll be here to help people, since he knows Uncle Might can't exactly be expected to be the hero he's always been before. Izuku's gonna have to step in for him. And so, focusing on the goal now ahead of him, Izuku would steel his nerves knowing that he has to do this. And for those of you wondering why these events are happening now instead of earlier when they canonically should happen, it's just because I switched the events so it could align a little bit better with the story that I'm telling, considering it kind of would have been really sucky for Izuku to find out the Island was literally under attack while he was a hero and he couldn't even help his family. That would have been pretty annoying. So I decided to move it up for that reason and another that I will shortly reveal. But anyways, continuing forth with the events that are taking place, Izuku would reveal his utility belt that he had been wearing just in case something like this would happen, as well as his modulator mask, as he would turn to Melissa saying to protect Eri that he'll handle this. As Izuku would do this, Class 1A would suddenly speak up in unison, telling him that they're heroes and that they're not going to be letting a civilian handle everything on their own. Izuku would smirk, saying that they have no idea who he is, with Iida stepping forth from the group saying that he does, that he's that boy. From the night that he had a run-in with a hero killer, he's the one who truthfully took him out. Everybody hearing this would be shocked, saying, "Whoa, you took out the hero killer?" To which Izuku would say that it's not the time for that, going on to say that if they want to help they better keep up, before urging a few of them to stay behind and protect Melissa and Eri, since if something manages to happen to them, the least of the heroes' worries will be the villains. And after hearing that declaration from Izuku that was told with a fierceness to it, A couple of the students from UA would stay behind, promising to protect them. After this, Izuku and the rest of the team, trying to keep up with him, would rush to the top, not exactly knowing what to do. Izuku, however, because he can run so much faster than the rest of them, would find himself towards the top area, making a little bit of a run-in with villains, seeing nobody other than Katsuki, Bakugo, and Kirishima. Izuku, noticing their presence, would think nothing of it, with him deciding that right now, things are more important than trying to have small talk with somebody that he used to consider a friend. And as Izuku would rush past, suddenly an elevator would appear, with two villains stepping out of it. Kirishima and Bakugo, seeing this, would say, "Huh? Who's that?" before they would then see the villains, and Izuku, wasting no time knowing that these two must be part of the villain organization, would turn them both to gold. Bakugo, however, now having seen Izuku rush past them with that unmistakable scruffy hair and that look on his face, Bakugo would utter, "Deku, is that?" as he would watch Izuku continuing forth with his mission, with him screaming behind him saying, "Who the hell are you, you spotlight stealing bastard?" Which would earn a little bit of a smile from Izuku, who, knowing Bakugo's clearly gonna follow after him, would not look behind as he would continue his way to the top, where on his way there a few minutes into this, Izuku would see a horde of robots making their way towards him. So Izuku, telling Bakugo to not touch the ground, would leap towards the direction of the center of where the robots are all accumulated at, and placing his hand on it, would turn every single one of them into solid gold. This would stun Bakugo, who would go on to say, "Damn it, Deku, don't order me around!" To which Izuku, ignoring the blonde boy, would rush towards a near window, knowing that there's no other access point to the roof, before kicking it and shooting his grappling hook to the top of the roof. This would then be followed by Bakugo rushing behind him saying, "Don't ignore me, damn it!" All the while Izuku, concentrated on his goal, would think to himself, "Damn it, David, why'd you have to go and increase security like this?" But his thoughts would be interrupted when Bakugo would say, "Damn it, Deku, I want answers!" However, Deku would simply yell back, "Stay out of my way, Kachan! We can talk when the villains are all taken care of." This would then earn a smile from Bakugo, would say, "When'd you go and get a pair of balls, Deku?" in his head, obviously not out loud, as both of them would make their way to the roof, where they would instantly be met by the big bad, Wolfram. This is when two of his henchmen, rushing towards the direction of Izuku, one with a blade quirk and another with a laser eye quirk, would proceed to try to land their attacks on Izuku. However, he, dodging them, having faced countless of villains like this, would proceed to turn both of them to gold, knowing that Eri could just undo his petrification. Now finally able to use his quirk freely without the fear of people being stuck like that, Izuku would then look towards Wolfram as he would see a giant piece of metal fly towards his direction. This would send Izuku crashing into a wall, to which another pillar would go rushing towards Izuku, hitting him head on, while Bakugo, rushing towards the direction of Wolfram, would simply yell out, "What, am I invisible?" throwing an explosion at his direction, which would be blocked by a metal barricade, before he himself would also be ragdolled by the villain Wolfram. As this would happen, Wolfram would clap, saying that they have impressive quirks. However, that won't mean much in his presence, before then grabbing the Dr. David and saying that unless they want to see this man's brains scatter all over the floor, they'll listen and do exactly what he says. Izuku, seeing this and knowing that this is the worst possible situation he could have gotten himself into, would then proceed to click a button on his utility belt, which would shoot a blinding light towards the direction of Wolfram, blinding the dude for a second, giving David just enough time to elbow him in the stomach and run away. This would give Izuku just enough opportunity to render Wolfram useless. He would tell Bakugo to jump now, to which he would do so, and the entire room would be turned into solid gold. A cage of gold would surround them. As Izuku would ask what the villain exactly intends to do, now having lost access to the only thing his quirk can help him with. And Wolfram, realizing that all he has now is his gun, would aim it towards the kid, telling him that he might have ruined his plan, but he's not going to walk out of here alive. The bullet would be shot towards Izuku's direction, to which he would dodge it easily, as Wolfram would shoot the entire clip at Izuku, who would dodge everything seamlessly, then turning to Bakugo and telling him to do it, with Bakugo uttering, "Don't tell me what to do, damn it!" throwing the explosion at Wolfram, which would render him unconscious, leaving Izuku to simply walk over towards him and petrify him as well. Izuku and Bakugo now being stuck in the room until they could find a way to break them out of there, considering that Izuku can't undo the petrification effect. This would leave Bakugo pissed off. He's like, "What? You can't control your quirk well enough to get us out of here? Damn, Deku, you're just as useless as always." To which Izuku would say, "Yeah, I'm happy to see you too, Katsuki." This is when an awkward silence would fill the area, with both of them not really knowing what to say to each other, until Bakugo would finally blurt out, "So, where have you been this whole time?" And Izuku would go on to reply that when he awakened his quirk, it wasn't exactly a good sight to behold. He explains that he completely turned his parents to gold and they've been petrified since. Bakugo, hearing this, would be shocked, having been told that they had simply moved away and that's what he had thought for so long. Izuku would go on to explain a little bit of the story of his life, with Kacchan cutting him off and saying that he doesn't care about the small stuff. He just wanted to know where he went. This is when Izuku would tell him that he probably would care, considering he went and became a vigilante. Bakugo, hearing this and looking at Izuku, would say, "There's no way you did something like that. Not Izuku, you're not the type." But Izuku would answer back that he is, saying, "You ever heard of the golden glider?" With Bakugo shocked, realizing that it must be him. The quirk, the height, even the fighting style suits the stories that he's heard. So with Bakugo and Izuku being stuck there until the next day when they could use metal cutters to, or not metal cutters, but gold cutters to just like dig into the room, having to cut through like the fattest little thick blob of gold ever, the two of them would be freed, with the Hero Commission knowing that Izuku's there, pretty much there to welcome and receive Izuku. Izuku would say to calm down, that he's not about to fight them, he was going to turn himself in tomorrow anyways. This would then earn him being grabbed by both arms by, the Hero Commission like guards, as they would go on to tell him that they can talk about all that later. For now, they're going to need to clean up this whole situation that David had created alongside Izuku. And Izuku, hearing that, would ask if Eri's safe and Melissa, with them replying that they are safe and the little girl has been taken possession of because she needs to go into proper care, not under some vigilante. Izuku, hearing that, would smile, knowing that good things will happen for Eri. And so, simply staying quiet, knowing that he'll have his time to speak with the commission later, would wait. This is when he would be transported to a different area where Izuku, now finally having the chance to speak to them, would go on to say that he was willingly going to turn himself in, and he had to act last night to save the people on the island. After all, countless people were going to get hurt and his second family were in danger. The Hero Commission would say that they understand why Izuku did it. They would say that they don't understand is why Izuku can't bring himself to see the bigger picture. Izuku's quirk is something that was helping the economy until Izuku was kidnapped and they had to do so much to get all that gold out of the world, promising to destroy it. And that after finally getting over that scandal and getting the boy back, he had decided to go out there and be a vigilante. Is he serious? While he's out there helping people who are getting mugged or robbed or other things, real families can't afford to put a roof over their head, much less afford food right now in this economy. Everything's been completely tipped on its head ever since Izuku was kidnapped by that ragtag group of villains. And Izuku, thinking of them, would then proceed to stare at the woman, who would go on to tell Izuku that from now on, he's gonna be under their jurisdiction and he's gonna do what they say, produce gold when they want him to, and eat, sleep, and think when they want him to. Izuku would snarl at this, saying that he could just kill himself and that way they won't be able to do anything. To which the Hero Commission would say that he wouldn't do that, especially not when they have his parents in custody, and that little girl Eri can undo the petrification of his parents. Once they can see that they can trust him, they'll allow the girl to go to his parents and undo the petrification, which would earn a fiery glare from Izuku, who stares back at the Safety Commission president before saying fine. And so, making his way back towards his living quarters, where Izuku is now gonna have to unfortunately live out the rest of his days, Izuku would cooperate with them, causing zero problems, knowing that this is the fastest way to get his parents turned. But after a couple of months would pass and still nothing would happen, Izuku would ask why in the world his parents still haven't been unpetrified, with them explaining that at the current moment and with the state of Japan, the least of their problems is unpetrifying his parents, since the country's currently under attack. Izuku would then ask why they haven't enlisted his help, since they know he has the capabilities of taking down countless swarms of villains as if they were nothing, and they would go on to tell him that it's too dangerous. If he dies, the rebuilding of Japan will be extremely pricey, and could literally leave the entire place of Japan bankrupt. This is when more time would pass, and as Shigaraki would continue having that operation done on him to make him even more powerful than ever, Shigaraki would be unleashed, with the pro heroes attacking the hospital and having that whole operation take place. Countless of heroes would lose their lives, with the League of Villains leader Shigaraki having successfully escaped, with the current successor of One For All Mirio having been unable to defeat him in battle. Izuku, catching wind of this, would tell the Hero Commission that they're stupid. He could simply go out there and turn that villain into solid gold, and the world would never have to worry about him again. But they would say that he could also simply decay him, turning him to dust, and they'll have no other plan against him other than Mirio. This would lead Izuku upset, to which the Hero Commission, realizing that their hand might be forced and Izuku really truly might just be the only way forward, would formally tell Izuku that they will let him fight in the next battle, telling him that one condition follows that he is to go to a specific room and turn countless bars of clay that they formed into solid gold. Izuku would do just that. And after Izuku would be done with this, the Hero Commission leader would go on to tell Izuku that it's finally time for his parents to be unpetrified. Izuku then would have a little bit of a reunion with Eri, with her saying, "Papa, how have you been?" since she has looked at Izuku as a dad-like figure. Izuku would say that he's been great, asking how she's been, how they've been treating her. She would say that it's been awesome, that she's been with the students that she met on the island since he had left, and that she knows that he's been busy doing hero work. Izuku would smile, saying that he has, to which Eri would ask if Izuku's finally ready to turn his parents back to normal. Izuku would say that he is, hugging Eri and thanking her. She would smile before placing her hands on both of Izuku's parents, and as the petrification would start to be undone, Izuku would feel tears pouring down his face, with him rushing at both of them and bringing them in for the tightest hug. They would be confused looking at this grown-up version of Izuku as they would say, "What happened?" And this is when Izuku, in tears, would start apologizing profusely, saying just how sorry he was for having ruined their lives for so long, and that he swears that this will never ever happen again. This would earn confused "it's okay" from his parents, with them eventually being filled in on what had happened and how Izuku had petrified them. This would earn a feeling of confusion from his parents, until eventually the both of them would look at each other, realizing that they are youthful compared to all their old friends now, aren't they? And Izuku would nod, saying sorry about that, with Inko going on to explain that that's awesome. That means she gets to live in an even newer age of technology, and she's gonna be able to shock her family and friends and even acquaintances with her youth. This would earn a cackle from Izuku's father, who would go on to say that that's the spirit, with him telling Izuku to not feel sorry for anything, that it was unavoidable and that Izuku did all he could to change them back. After Izuku would finally have that weight lifted off of his shoulder, and hearing those words that it was okay and it wasn't his fault, Izuku in his mind could feel as though something had just been unlocked within him, something that Izuku has been trying to force open for so long, holding him back by the fear and anxiety that he would never be able to undo this effect. But with that being said, and seeing the smiles of his mom and dad, Izuku could finally feel whole again. So now, staring towards the Safety Commission, he would ask how exactly this whole thing's gonna go down, with him fully being briefed on what the situation is, and Inko crying, saying that she doesn't want to send her baby out with a mass murderer that could turn him to dust. But Izuku, looking at his mom, would say, "Mom, I know you still see me as a little boy, but I'm a hero now, and if my life can save all of Japan, then trust me when I say that I'll do this in an instant." His mother would look at him with a sad expression on her face, as she would understand that the baby boy that she remembers is no longer there. Izuku's turned into a man while she's been petrified, and she's only saddened that she missed that, but proud of her son. Hiyashi would hug Izuku, telling him to go out there, Tiger, and make sure that he takes care of everything. Izuku would say he plans on it, and so he would be informed on every single bit of the situation, with the discovery of Aoyama being the UA traitor having taken place just like in Canyon, considering that the person who found that out was Invisible Girl. So regardless of Izuku being there in the actual class, that doesn't mean that it would stop events. I still feel like Class 1A would still somehow get through to Aoyama, and even though he would be scared out of his mind, the plan would still go through. So Izuku, being sent towards the area where Shigaraki was fighting against the heroes, would land with a gigantic jet wing which would drop him from the sky, as Izuku, now entering the battlefield, would stand face to face with Shigaraki, then telling him that his reign of terror is over, explaining that from now on, he's gonna live out the rest of his short life as a golden statue, which would earn a cackle from the villain, who would tell him that he wishes he would try. This is when Izuku would then rush towards the villain, trying to place his hands on him so he could turn him to solid gold, since knowing the caliber of opponent he's facing, it would probably be unlikely for him to be caught off guard by an attack that travels through the ground and not at insane speeds. So as Izuku lunges towards the direction of Shigaraki, he would grow his limbs, forcing Izuku away. This would lead to a cat and mouse game, with Mirio distracting Shigaraki while Izuku would attempt to get closer. But as these attempts fail, and Mirio would land a barrage of countless one-for-all strikes towards the direction of Shigaraki, and it would seem that Izuku wasn't even needed on the battlefield, that Mirio could do it, Shigaraki would once again find himself able to use every single quirk at his disposal, Kurogiri having been freed from the hospital, and disrupting Aizawa and Monama's efforts to keep the man quirkless. This is when Shigaraki would turn the tide of the battle, and Mirio would find himself on the back foot attempting to help his friends, but Shigaraki would take full advantage of this, landing deadly blows on Mirio, which would slowly weaken the hero, who, without the usage of the extra quirks that Izuku had, due to Mirio's vessel already being inhabited by a separate quirk, this would make things difficult for Mirio to keep up with the enhanced villain with hundreds of quirks. Izuku, realizing that unless he does something now, every single person in Japan will fall under the tyranny of this wicked villain, Izuku would attempt to place his hand on the ground and turn Shigaraki to gold. However, this unfortunately would only have the opposite effect, turning his friends to gold, all the while Shigaraki would manage to evade the attack. This is when all too suddenly, a pink orb flying towards Izuku's direction would yell out, "Put your heart into it, kid!" As Izuku, looking up to see the Sinister Six had arrived to help him, would be stunned. They would all land, telling Izuku that they know he can handle this, and that they'll back that kid up. And so the Sinister Six, Mirio, and Izuku would all face off against the enhanced Shigaraki, who, using his quirks, would start picking off members of the Sinister Six one by one, calling them weaklings, Cage being taken out first, considering that his bullets were not able to do a thing to Shigaraki, and Caitlyn, trying to protect Zoom from one of Shigaraki's super speed attacks to counter his own, would have her barrier shatter in front of Zoom as Zoom would be knocked to the ground. Suddenly, Tremor, flying in out of nowhere, attempting to use his quirk on him, would completely fail, with a screech coming out of Shigaraki's voice courtesy of Present Mike, stunning the Dementor quirk man, as out of nowhere Reiner, turning into poison, would attempt to fill Shigaraki's air ducts. However, Shigaraki's speed healing would completely undo these effects, and as Izuku could see just how hard his family was fighting to stick by his side, Izuku could suddenly feel his quirk feeling strange. His entire body would turn to that of gold, with it not petrifying, but feeling that every metaphorical shackle Izuku had placed on himself had disappeared. Izuku, then facing his gaze towards the direction of Shigaraki, would tell the villain that it's over. Touching the ground before every single person on the battlefield that was petrified thanks to his quirk would be undone, and after doing so, Izuku would tell Zoom, "I need your help." Zoom, recognizing this, would nod, saying that he's happy to help, as he would rush Izuku towards the direction of Shigaraki. With Shigaraki being bombarded from every angle by quirks from everybody, this would leave a perfect opening in the villain, which Izuku would fully take advantage of. Then, as Izuku found himself mere inches away from Shigaraki about to touch him, the villain would simply say that he's a fool if he thinks he was going to let himself be petrified. However, as Izuku would feel himself be smacked away with ribs and his arm breaking, Izuku, using his pistol and powering his quirk through the bullet, something he had never been able to do before, would shoot it towards the direction of Shigaraki, who would cackle that a mere bullet won't do anything to him. Unable to sense the danger, the bullet would hit Shigaraki, doing nothing, before suddenly the villain found himself completely petrified. Every single fiber of his being unable to move would stop the entire battlefield, as cries of excitement would be heard and people would start cheering. However, this is when on the other side of the battlefield, All For One would defeat All Might in his, robot form, flying towards there and arriving clapping, saying that they've done well to petrify his student. However, rushing towards the direction of Izuku with his quirk rewind activated on himself, basically making it so that even if Izuku turned him into gold, his quirk would rewind him the instant it happened, and dragging him into the ocean where he would plan to drown him. Izuku would realize the quirk that All For One was using in that moment, and his rage would fill him, thinking that he had stolen the quirk from Eri and must have hurt the little girl who was just freed from another villain in Overhaul. Would feel rage overflow him, and his quirk would evolve even further, as Izuku could feel the air in his lungs being replaced by water. Izuku would reach his hand out into the sea, with him using all of the quirk fiber that he has left, turning the entire ocean along with himself and All For One into gold. This would literally leave an entire ocean of the world petrified as solid gold. Sharks, fish, shrimp, everything, you name it, it's all petrified. And with Izuku and All For One being trapped down there, and Shigaraki being petrified, the heroes won. But it was at the cost of Izuku Midoriya's life. Because with the depth that they had reached with All For One attempting to drown Izuku, there was no possible way that the heroes were going to be able to reach Izuku. So as the battlefield would grow grim and people would realize that they've won but it cost Izuku his life, suddenly Mirio, piping up, would say, "What? No it didn't," as he would rush towards the direction of Izuku in the depths of the gold. He would grab a hold of Izuku, as his quirk, thanks to the effect of One For All, would have evolved to allow him to turn other people into a permeated state. So dragging Izuku out of there before the oxygen that he had in that area would completely dissipate, Izuku would be dragged up to the surface where once laid down, Izuku's body would be completely immobile before suddenly water would start coming out of his lungs, with Mirio realizing that had he not acted at that second, Izuku might have been dead. This is when Izuku, now waking up, seeing the golden sea around him, would wonder if he really just did that. And as everybody would stare at Izuku, they would all nod, saying that he did. His quirk is incredible. Izuku would look towards them as he would say that he's glad that they're all okay, before then apologizing for transforming that entire sea that they use into solid gold. As we would then see Izuku attempting to undo the petrification of the sea, but it just wouldn't work. Izuku had done that in a state of literal flow where his quirk had evolved beyond everything, and for Izuku to undo the effects of what he had just done would require Izuku so much energy that it would literally drain his life force. So now with an entire sea worth of gold at the disposal of Japan, this would low-key crash the economy, with all the money in the world being given to Japan and eventually all the currency of the world being replaced by gold and coins. This would change everything in the world as we know it, but Izuku, Eri, his family, and even the Sinister Six, they're all fine now. And with every threat in the story being taken care of, Izuku would be given a provisional license, with him being turned into a full-fledged hero, becoming the youngest hero in Japan, and being told by the Hero Commission that since he had turned an entire ocean to gold and they'll likely never run out of it, he's allowed to become a hero, being told to make them proud, with Izuku nodding and Izuku walking home to a massive welcome home party where the Sinister Six would be there, the heroes that fought along Izuku, Eri, and even Bakugo and his family. Izuku walking in would be stunned that they would do something like this for him. But as Izuku would look at all of their smiling faces, Izuku would think to himself that he's blessed and he was given the greatest life ever. This, however, is when the TV would suddenly flash a channel, which would go on to say that thanks to that incident that happened in Japan, the world's currency system has been completely flipped on its head. And America is fighting to make Izuku Midoriya a criminal, with them attempting to get Izuku Midoriya to stand trial in the US. This is when Izuku would get a text from the Hero Commission going on to tell him not to worry, that they'll try to handle it. And even if they can't, Izuku and the heroes will. But ladies and gentlemen, that's a story for another day, because this is where I'm going to be wrapping up what if Deku had Midas's golden touch. Please, 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 if you enjoyed this video, smash a like on this one, because I genuinely poured my heart and soul into this. I know this is like probably the third time I've told you guys this, but seriously, I worked so hard on this. So please, a like will go a long way, as well as a comment, maybe even a rewatch, like the whole thing, just play it in the background while you're like doing whatever. But yeah, that's been it for me today. Expect another banger coming to you guys this Saturday, since that's around the time that I'm expected to drop What If Naruto Was a Hyuga. But with that all out of the way, ladies and gentlemen, it has been your boy Xehther. I love each and every single one of you guys. Peace.